Hey guys, how are you doing tonight?
Good. How are you?
Doing well. It's always awkward when I ask that. But yeah, thanks for joining us, Cole. And I'm gonna probably screw up your name because I screw up everybody's name, but I've always assumed it was Whirl, like Whirly Gig, because of your company. Is that correct?
Well, sort of. It's Whirly.
Okay.
It was funny.
Oh,
Drew and I, when we like engineered the name of the company, we thought this will help people pronounce their name right, but it didn't. It like got us halfway there. I don't get picky about it. My ancestors decided to anglicize the pronunciation, but not the spelling. So
okay.
everything I get is their fault, and I don't mind.
Oh, can I ask? Because I love hearing about like where people are from.
Oh,
Maybe
so
maybe
I am split down the middle pretty evenly between like Welsh and an Anglican ancestry, and then German. And my father's side comes from Baden-Baden and like the Blackwoods region. They're all watchmakers. You can get like a little whirly watch if you hunt for them.
okay. Well, that's
There you go.
fantastic information. Okay, well, cool. So we're going to talk about history and some games and things like that. I thought we'd just start off by maybe if you would want to give an introduction for those that aren't familiar with your past.
Sure.
Um, so you're the designer of Root and Pax Pamir and some other historical games, John Company, um, and some stuff. But if people aren't familiar with your past, you did a PhD in history, correct?
It was in English lit, but my
English
work,
lit.
I
Okay.
had history folks on my committee, and it was, I think English is a very broad field. And so some folks who work in it have kind of like one foot in different departments, and I definitely had like one foot in the history department.
Yeah, yeah. I like the cross discipline stuff. That's really cool. So English literature, that's different than what I. So you might have been surprised by my questions related to history. Then, well, what? So let's change it. This, and then if you're
No,
okay
no, no.
going.
I love talking about history. I mean,
Okay. Well, kind of extemporaneous here, but tell me about what started you down that path of history, but also English lit.
sure,
If you
sure,
go
sure.
into
Well, I
that.
mean, I got, I took a lot of history courses in undergrad, and I was always into it. Um, I don't know. I mean, there was always something magnetic about it. At my high school, I felt like all the charismatic teachers were all math teachers or history teachers. They just pulled me into it, and there was something about the way that it organized the past. I mean, I think people will tell you that, like, oh, history, it's about a story, and it's very narrative driven. It's why one of the reasons why students really like studying it, because if it's taught well, it feels like there's this like powerful narrative. But
Yeah.
for me there was this added element that it was like archaeology, it was like genealogy, it was about understanding the present moment
Mm.
and trying to like figure out the different currents that course through the moment, because it's never over, right? We're never at the end of anything.
Hmm.
And so when growing up, I was always reading history books. I think I've probably read more history books than novels. It's like what I do for fun is I'm reading
Yeah.
history books, and so I just I was always cooking on those. And then when did my undergraduate at Indiana University in Bloomington, and they had a very strong history department. And
Hmm.
so I remember I didn't really, I had kind of a bad counselor. That's maybe not fair, but they didn't give me good guidance on what courses would be appropriate for a freshman to take.
Okay.
And so, and these were like right before they started erecting a lot of the prerequisite limits. And so one of the first classes I took as an undergrad was Byzantine history, which was an upper division course in the history department. And
Yeah.
I had no idea what I was getting involved with and just got ruined by that class. But I was hooked after it. I wanted more. Like, even though I didn't do badly, but it wasn't easy. I just kept taking them, and it was I remember thinking, if I didn't have a history course on my schedule, I always felt kind of unmoored. Um, and I was completely agnostic about period. They were all over the place. I was just jumping and trying to grab as much as I possibly could. And then what ended up happening is, as an undergrad, I studied journalism. Actually, I think that was where the interest in history probably came from. I was studying journalism, and especially like I thought I wanted to be an investigative a reporter. I wanted to be a beat reporter, and I wanted to rise through the ranks, and that was what I wanted to do.
Okay.
Unfortunately, I graduated right when the newspaper industry collapsed.
Mhm.
And it was, but it was like before social media. Like I remember the Facebook news feed came out like the year I graduated from college, but it hadn't occurred to like a local news organization that they needed a Facebook page yet. So there were just no jobs for young journalists. So I did some different kinds of work. But while I was in journalism school, I picked up a major in English and then some concentrations in history. And I was really interested in the 20th century, globalization, the post-colonial period. And I was very involved in different activist circles. And what happened was the more I got interested in it, the more it started pulling me into the 19th and 18th century. Because as soon as you understand how something really horrible happened in the 40s, now you want to read the prequels, right? And you just keep, the problem with history is you get stuck in this chain, and it keeps pulling you back into the past. And I think if I would have kept at it, I might have ended up being like studying the Restoration or something.
Huh. Okay.
I feel that I realized I had a big empty spot for like knowing much about apartheid, and then started reading about it, and then just kept going back, and then got overwhelmed into the scramble.
Mm-hmm.
And then right. Recently I just was like, well, maybe I'll just start at like recorded works, or like there's a podcast I listen to called Literature and History.
Mm-hmm.
And I was like, well, I'll start at the beginning. We'll read some Gilgamesh and work our way forward. Because it's just, it's super interesting about that. Throughline, that's a good podcast on NPR, just for history. Sorry.
Yeah, this is the way these conversations go. So you totally made me think of a side note, and if this catches you off guard, that's fine. You don't have to answer this question. But Guns, Germs, and Steel,
sure.
And then also I can't think of the name of the other book, but the Russian guy that used to study beetles from Yukon. Do you not know who I'm talking about?
I know Guns, Germs, and Steel.
Oh, okay. Anyway, Turkin? I don't know. See, this is where I get to terrible names. But both of them are like almost hated by historians because
Correct.
they have these grand kind of meta-narrative stories about history and civilization. Do you have a feeling on either one of them personally?
So I know Guns, Germs, and Steel and Collapse quite well.
Yeah.
And they're such interesting books. They're doing historic work in like a very grand tradition. Like they're almost like 19th century style histories where he's like, I'm going to look, Jared Diamond, that's the guy's name.
Yeah.
Diamond is like, he's looking for some grand totalizing theory that is going to line up everything.
Right.
And sometimes he's very right. I mean, one of the things about Guns, Germs, and Steel is there are parts of that book that I think are very clarifying. Mm. And there are other parts, and I think Collapse is very guilty of this, where he is a little overzealous in his desire to find a through line.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And so he starts stitching together all these different stories that like probably shouldn't be stitched together. And his argumentation gets really loose and wobbly. I used to use the example of those two books for my undergrads because many of them had read parts of Guns, Germs, and Steel. Where like, if you write a book that resonates with people and is successful, they'll let you write anything. And you're going to write a book like Collapse.
Right.
You argue way off base, and you get way out in front of your skis, as the Minnesotans might say. Okay. But I think that I try to be an omnivore when it comes to the history I'm reading. Like I do actually really admire writers who write in a more populist mode, who try to like write and sometimes folks who've been through the academy get in trouble for writing popular histories, right?
Sure.
And I do think that there's value in it. I mean, one of my favorite histories of the United States I read last year, and it's the new one by Jill Lepore called These Truths.
Okay. And
it's a fascinating history of the United States. I mean, and I think the first half of that book is stunning because it's like a diamond book. It's got a theory of how the United States works and about the role of capital T truth in our systems of law and justice, and in our national character, and our institutions, and the places where those institutions fail us, and how we're wrestling with this concept. And then when she gets into the 20th century, like she's obviously looking at what's going to happen with, the Republican Party and Trump, and thinking about the current moment we're in, our fractured media landscape is like that. That's her kind of coda. But I think she gets too specific and polemical in the second half, and her argument doesn't quite work as well. But the first half of that book is staggeringly brilliant. And so I think there's a lot of value for historians saying like, no, I want to make an argument. I'm going to be like Macaulay or something and make these sweeping arguments. So I think there is a lot of power to that too.
Yeah. So on that note, do you have research interests still, or are you just doing the game thing mainly? And
that is a great question. So that is a good question. It's so funny. I was at my parents' house very briefly this summer, and took with me my box of dissertation books, because there's a couple chapters for my dissertation that I kind of want to publish. And I start thinking to myself that I might have time to actually get them ready for a peer-reviewed journal. They were very close when I stopped, because what happened was the academic job market, I thought I was going to get a position somewhere. It looked pretty good. And then it fell through, as so often it happens. And then right when I was getting ready to gather all my papers and get ready to launch into the second round of going out into the world, I was in contention for this game design job.
Okay.
And then my dissertation defense is such a funny character, because I had a great time because it was so low stakes for me. Because I walked in being like, well, I think I already have a job, and it doesn't have to do with anything here. And I like all of the people on my committee, and I really like the product I did. And so they were arguing with me, but in the way that if you're in a low stakes environment, you can argue better. You don't get so tight. I had a great defense. It was really fun. And then afterwards they're like, okay, cool. Let's get your stuff ready. You guys get to the next step. And I was like, well, actually now I'm going to announce to you that I'm probably going to be leaving the academy and going off and doing this weird game thing, because the university has been around for a couple hundred years. The game industry is only maybe a couple dozen years old. So I don't know if the game industry, how long it's going to last, but I'd rather spend my 30s there. But I do try to stay current. I mean, I think here's how I think about it. I try to stay somewhat current in my field. Most of these I'm just really interested. I study the 19th century. And so I'll read the newest issue of Victorian Studies. Almost always. They come out quarterly. It's not that big of it's like you're getting buried in New Yorkers or something. But outside of that, I always have 2 or 3 areas of research that I'm really pushing on, that I become quasi obsessed with. And so my reading is kind of divided in 4 ways, where I have a research area that I'm really gunning for. And then I have some fiction that I'm reading. And then I have general interest stuff, which is completely eclectic all over the place. And then there's the audiobooks, which don't count or whatever. But I almost my wife makes fun of me for it, because I will rotate every day. It's Monday, it's book club night, so I'm reading whatever the book club thing is. Okay. And then Tuesday is my research area night. So something I'm reading right now. For the past year or two, I've been reading a lot about American Reconstruction, because I'm potentially going to be preparing a game on the subject. And it's a very tricky subject. And so I recently read Henry Louis Gates Jr.'s Stony Road, which is fabulous. I'm giving Eric Foner's big book on Reconstruction a second read. There's a couple other kind of closely related to those that I'm going for. And then, unrelated, I'm reading a history of dinosaurs. And then I'm reading this book about the Bible right now that's really fascinating that I can go into. But I don't know. I like to be... I don't know. I'm just a curious kid. I'd like to be nibbling at lots of stuff at once. But usually I'll have 1 or 2 areas where I'm going really, really deep, and then a couple areas where I'm just kind of skating on the surface and kind of seeing.
Yeah, no, I think that relates to my next question for you, is how do you avoid so you're reading all that and you're thinking about, I could use this in a game. How do you avoid trivializing the historical events in a game? Actually, that's one of the ways I first found Pax Pamir. Was there was one of the most interesting board game reviews that I had seen. I don't even remember who did it at the time, but they were like, this is a complicated subject, and some people aren't going to be happy with this game because it's a complicated subject. And that made me want to play the game more, and then read some more. And I got to read more. I'm terrible with names, so I don't remember what I read at the time. But when I first found the game, I read some books and articles about the history of Afghanistan that I wasn't familiar with, and just going through that, like how do you avoid that? Because I'm sure there's even more in any, whether it's American Reconstructionism or British colonialism or whatever, there's things in there that a specialist is going to go, hey, you trivialize this.
Yeah, well, it's a game, ahead. Right? I mean, at one level, if I go to someone who knows the period really well and who's spent their life, working on it, and I tell them, well, I designed a funny board game. It's on Kickstarter. Yeah. You want to take a look at it? They're going to think I'm making chutes and ladders and really trying to trivialize it. So in my approach, pedagogy is kind of everything. These games are teaching instruments. Yeah. And the tabletop then becomes like a form that I'm working in, like a lesson plan or something. Mm-hmm. And every lesson plan has some things that it's going to be very good at and some things it's going to be very bad at, right? And so when I think about the game form is really good at introducing players to pressures. Everybody has to understand all the pressures, because if you don't understand the pressures that a playing position is under, you can't play the game, which is just another way of saying you have to know all the rules to play the game. Sure. Now, this is different from a video game, because a video game can hide pressures. Mm-hmm. So you can feel under pressure in a video game, but like not know exactly where that pressure is coming from. The fact that board games are known systems is really important, because essentially that makes them a lot like a model, which kind of puts me like in the world of like economics, right? Or sociology. You have to build a model of something. The other thing that I think games are really good at doing is generating sympathy. You are going to be asked to relate with people. Mm-hmm. And that's a very, very powerful tool for education. It's also a very dangerous tool, because if you ask them to relate with the wrong people or for the wrong reasons, pretty soon people can be playing a game and getting something very different from it, right? Yeah. So when I'm thinking about a project, I spend a lot of time thinking about the model and making sure it is accurate and well built, and it's okay that if it has argument. I mean, I'm not pretending to be objective about any of this stuff. I come to every project with my own biases. Mm-hmm. And so every game is argumentative, but I want it to be a model that is well vetted and makes sense. And then it's also important that in that argumentation, the way the game is directing sympathy is to some kind of higher aim. So I'll give an example of this is a game I did on the Opium Wars called Infamous Traffic. Mm-hmm. And that's a tricky subject. And originally I designed it as an asymmetric game. I wanted some players to play smugglers, some players to play the Chinese government, and then some players to play the small British trading firms. But what I found was it put the players on an uneven moral plane. The players who were playing the Chinese government, who were trying to stop the opium trade, mm-hmm. Were assuming a kind of moral high position, which is not unwarranted at all. But the British, within the space of one game, the British players would stop behaving in ways that made any kind of historic sense, because they didn't want to be the bad guys. So in order to fix this problem, I made everybody the bad guys. Okay. And then was very clear in the rulebook materials and how the game is presenting that you are playing the bad guys, and you need to understand what engine powered the Opium Wars, which is respectability politics back home in England, right? Yeah. I mean, basically all the horrible things that you're doing in Infamous Traffic are for petty social prizes back home, like a nicer house, right? Or a lavish fox hunt or something. And it's important to cast them in that light, because when you read the letters of people who are working at like the Russell firm or something, that's what they're interested in. Yeah. They're not telling their companions back home about like this good deal that they just scored, or this war they're thinking about ginning up. They're asking about the London season.
Right.
And they're asking about these like lavish gifts they're giving each other. So like if their minds are trained on those things, I want to make sure the model also trains its attention there. So, and all that to say is like these games are invitation. I mean, invitations for argument. Somebody can play Pax Pamir and say, I don't think this is fair to like the Pashtu, or like I don't think this is fair to the Persians. Yeah. And then I want to present a very different version of the whole period from the Persian lens. Heck, I mean, you could play. I mean, Pax Pamir is a game about Afghanistan, seated in an Afghan perspective. But I think that a player who wanted to make to do a traditional British and Russian geopolitical read of the Great Game could do one. And it isn't any better or worse. Well, it might be worse, but I would be happy to engage it on its own merits. And in fact, there is a game. What is the name of the first one? It's just simply called The Great Game. It was published by Legion Games. And it is a very like Twilight Struggle style, top-down, 19th century geopolitics, traditional war game. Yeah. And it's a completely reasonable way of viewing the period.
Yeah, no, it's interesting because as you were talking, I was thinking about like, this is a topic we're going to come back to next season for us. But like the qualia of a game, like what it feels like mentally.
Sure.
And it's interesting that you use the word pressure because thinking about a game like I love GMT games, but like playing Gallipoli 1917 or whatever it is, playing something like that versus playing Pax Pamir. The feel of the pressure is completely different. And there's really no empathy for the World War I soldiers.
Yeah.
in the one, but it is completely like tactical, logistical pressure that's happening in that versus what you get to feel when you play a game like Pax Pamir. So I appreciate you putting it that way. And it definitely comes through in the way it's designed. So, before I just dominate all the questions here, I'm gonna
get in here, Ryan.
Yeah, I'm gonna switch over to Ryan some of his questions for you because I know he had some game design questions, and we're kind of getting into the meat of that right here.
So. Yeah, sure.
Yeah, and you're kind of touching on this too, which is exciting. Like one of my big questions is like just how do you decide on the project you're going to be focusing on, especially since you are, I forgot the word, since you like to learn and
yes,
and you have many different interests. So,
well, it's funny. I have a lot of friends from my college years and after that are doing lots of interesting jobs. And one of my good friends is in the music industry, and he's done very well. And he, out of all my friends, he is the one that I feel like when I talk about work with him, we see most eye to eye, which is to say, at the beginning, you're hungry for any project that will provide you infrastructure to work, right? So no matter what it is, as long as they're going to give you some resources to work, you're just so hungry to get your voice out there, you'll take it. But one of the things that happens, and it certainly happened to me, is you start to recognize the high opportunity cost of every project. A game takes a long time to make. And I have no illusions about this. I know that I will hopefully get to make like maybe 10 games over the course of my career, maybe less. And I want to make sure they're good, and I want to make sure I spend my time well. And so when someone asks me to make a game for their like movie property, I have to think very carefully if like I want to spend one of my games on it, right? Like this is, I can't sum it up better than that. Like the opportunity cost of these projects is very, very, very high. So the qualification I use when thinking about a game is I just ask myself a very simple question, which is, does it feel urgent? Which is, if I don't do it, will someone else do it? And if the answer is someone else is going to do it, then I don't want to race them. I feel great relief. It means I don't have to spend my time making a World War II game. Great. I can go work on a different thing. And so it's funny, sometimes when people are pitching us games at Leader, back when I used to go to conventions, when people would be pitching us a game, they would say like, oh, they would try to bait you. They'd be like, oh, Renegade's looking at this. They're pretty excited. What do you think? You better act fast. And I'd say, oh, great. I'm so happy. Go to Renegade. But it's just like, I have no interest now. I might have been a little interested before, but now I'm just not, because I know that your game is going to get made. That's lovely.
Yeah.
So like the urgency is everything. And then the one other thing I'll say to that is I usually have like two little conversations going on in my notes. I write a lot about my process, both stuff that gets published and also stuff that I just write. I have a running design journal that I write in when I'm working on a project. I write it every day. When I'm in between projects, it might be every few days. I'll write a little about what I'm thinking about. And whenever I play a new game, or, if I play a game at lunch, like we've been playing a lot of Undaunted at work during lunch, and I'm writing about Undaunted in my little game journal where I'm like, oh, it does these things really well. I don't really like how it does this thing. And what will happen is I'll start having ideas like, I wonder if you could do a game that did X, this like thing that I haven't really seen done. So like with Oath, one of the questions behind Oath was like, can you build a PAX style game without a card market? Like that's a mechanical puzzle. What does a PAX style game look like without a card market? Turns out that's a crazy, tricky problem. Also, like, what if you build a game without card flow? Like if a PAX game has a deck that has acts built into it and then it runs through, and it's very high turnover, a PAX game is going to need to go through like 50 or 60 cards.
Yeah.
Could you do a game in like 20 cards that felt as big, right? And so that's a mechanical question. That doesn't say anything about theme. And then on the other hand, I'm thinking about stories, and that might be a historic period, or it might just be like a narrative trope that isn't being answered by the current game landscape, the games that are being published. And every once in a while, two things will like click together. So with Pamir, the very short version of Pamir is I wanted a game about something outside of Empire. So not a game about the Brits conquering things, but a game about a center of power on the edge of Empire. So that was the thematic interest. And then the mechanical interest was, I wondered if you could make a tableau builder be a portfolio game, where you were trying to like, okay, I'm building my tableau, but also I have 3 shares of British power and I can pivot to 2 shares of Afghan power. And like that very rough idea was what, like, I mean, everyone saw those kind of two tumblers in a lock, and they'll line up, and then the pin can go through, and the game starts to take off. I told you I had long answers. I'm sorry.
I know it's just a eloquent answer. I'm just I'm over here.
Well, no, it's not. I mean,
yeah, we were both fanboying a little bit when you said yes to this.
Yeah. Oh, good.
What I found really interesting is how similar your answer was. I've talked to a couple game designers before, even though this is our first one for the show. How similar your answer was about like, oh, somebody else is already making that. That's great. Not in a harmful way, truly in a benevolent way of like, okay, you're already doing that. Wonderful. I don't have to worry about that anymore. Like, I think that sense of when I have the freedom to say no is a wonderful thing in any career, but especially in game design, since there's 5,000 games coming out. If you can be like, yep, that's one thing I don't have to worry about at all.
I am in such a lucky position because I do feel like, at least for the next few years, we'll see if things hold, I get to pick my projects, and I try to exercise a lot of discretion, because kind of nothing bothers me more than someone who has a lucky break just absolutely going ham and like trying to publish every single game they could possibly think of. And it just bums me out, because what's happening in situations like that is they might have a long backlog of games that they've been storing up, and they get a break and they get a platform and they just start jumping them out. And what bothers me about that, just from a perspective of craft, is they should be learning, right? Like they should be learning and improving their craft. And what often happens is they spit a bunch of things out and the quality goes down and not up, right?
Right.
And I'm not, I won't pick anybody in particular, but this is just, this is to me like a very common trope. And so I try to be really careful about it, because Yeah.
Saying it in a positive way about your games is I didn't love this game at first. I do now. But I played
Think critically.
It grew on me. And then also what I grew to love is the fact that as more expansions came out, and what was fascinating was to see you and Patrick talk about it the other day, your thought process about what was going on with the expansions, about like, here's the one with the quirky little things, and here's the one if you want the expansion, if you want a solid game with some different choices and stuff. The fact that you had actually thought through your expansions, and they weren't expansions just for the sake of expansions, but they were expansions for the particular situation that you wanted to happen, and then you made it all come together in a really good way. It just grew my enjoyment of that game. So go ahead. Yeah.
No. So what I was going to say was that we try at Leader, and this is true in a lot of projects I work on, to be really mindful of the fact that people are only going to, there might be more games coming out, and there are certainly more people playing, but we want to be very mindful of like our product line, because the most common model. So this is like business chat. We've exited history chat. We can come back to history chat, but now it's business chat. The most common model in this industry is publish as much as you can. Maintain a reasonably high standard of quality, which is to say your games have rules and the rules work, right? And know that the one successful game is going to pay for the next like 40 mistakes. Right. And you want to try to get yourself on a footing where you can kind of, we usually call this like the churn model, which is not fair to the many good and well-intentioned folks who are running this way, but they're on a treadmill. They've got to spit out X number of games. The model at Leader and the model at Wehrlegig and some other places that I've been affiliated with is all about the long tail, which is, we're going to do 3 games. We want 2 of them to get a second print run, and maybe the third one will get a third print run. Mm-hmm. But we structure everything, our pricing structure, our retail strategy, everything is around the notion that if these games just pay for their own creation, that's enough, and we continue to move on. Yeah. We don't have a huge amount of overhead. We don't have like an owner like up in the woods, like just chilling out and taking big dividends. Right. Like our whole premise is, if we go broke in a decade, and all that we have to show for it is the decade of made games and the fact that we were able to maintain a middle-class life during those years, that will have been a very good decade spent. At least that's my approach. Other people at the company may have, more dollar signs in their eyes. But I very much think about it like when I went to graduate school, my one of my mentors, brilliant professor named Josh Marsh at IU, I was thinking about it, and she said, the thing about grad school is that when you're 30, all of your friends will own homes and you won't. Mm-hmm. And you just need to be comfortable with that. That like you're delaying your career in such a way that is going to put you in poverty for about a decade. And I mean, I had 2 kids in grad school, and we were on food stamps for a couple of those years. It was tough. Yeah. We had lots of rice and beans those many years in Austin, and I have no regrets about it. And I have a fair bit of student loans from the whole thing too, because I always went into grad school being like, I am so lucky that I get to spend my 20s talking about books and reading and teaching. Yeah. And whatever I do after that period, I thought, even before the game thing, and I was thinking like, should I go work at a bank? Do I need to go find like a marketing firm? I really had no idea what I was going to do. Yeah. But even thinking that, even knowing that wherever I was going to start, it would be on the bottom rung, I didn't mind that investment, because I got to spend my 20s in a way that was really enriching. And so that's kind of how I look at this time in the game industry. Like, so the way I think about Oath is, what I often say about Oath is that it's far too big for any small studio to take on, but far too risky for any big studio. Yeah. It's just big. It's just a complicated, big game. And in fact, our editor, we caught a very small errata. It's like trivial. Yeah. But our editor sent me a message today. He's like, "Oh, I feel that like imposter syndrome come in because we have this like tiny print errata." And I said, one nice thing about working on a project like Oath is that when you're you're doing something that's never been done, and so when you're out on the bleeding edge of something, you can't be an imposter because there's no one that you're imposting. There's just no one out here we're pretending to be, because our whole attitude about Oath was, we have these resources, we have this goodwill, let's spend all of that capital and make something completely wild. And if it collects dust and is discovered in 20 years when some kid goes into his uncle's game closet, like, that's pure unalloyed magic.
Yeah.
And so like, it's not really about like trying to make a new route or trying to like shoot the moon twice or anything like that. Yeah. Now, I'm speaking entirely for myself. Patrick's a very savvy businessman. I'm sure he's, got like a 10-year plan or something that has us all retired. I don't know.
Yeah. I'm gonna, because we're limited on time here. And we were.
Yeah. Go ahead. Sorry. See, I told you.
No. You're fine. I'm gonna let Ryan ask the next.
I'm taking it.
I mean, we could talk forever because you're making me think of tons of questions, and this is awesome. And I do want to say before Ryan asks his next question, though, like, it's been really, really evident that Oath is a passion project for you. I'm looking forward to trying it out. I will say, I don't know that you care or not. I'm trying to give myself really low expectations about it.
Good. You should.
So that I can be pleasantly surprised once again.
Yeah, I mean, the way I think, it's funny because Oath is passion project is like, it looks like one, but what it actually is a very large wager. So it's like Oath is a content-rich game that approaches the legacy format with a very different kind of strategy.
Okay.
And maybe that check will clear, and maybe it won't. But it's an interesting thing to attempt. It's like it is a concept piece in like the most open like way that can be used. And I think it's right to come at it with low expectations. I mean, you always want low expectations, right? I'm not going to argue that away, but it is such its own thing. I think I can see a lot of people liking it a lot, and a lot of people absolutely hating it, and I'll be delighted by their hatred, of course. I mean, you have to. Every morning, this is very short. Every morning, I read the comments for everything I've worked on.
Yeah.
And some mornings I have a little spring in my step after that, and some mornings it's a bracing experience. Yeah. And but I do it because it grounds me. It like, hey, many people are not going to like the stuff that you do, and that's okay. Mm-hmm. And you should understand that critique, learn from the parts you can learn from, and then throw away the parts that are them Absolutely. Being mad because like mice can't shoot a bow or something.
Right.
It is not when you're looking.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Ryan gets it.
So, Ryan, what did you want to ask next?
I mean, yeah, that's one of my big things is like negative feedback and like managing. Like, I've read the comment sections. I'm not on social networking anymore because I can't do it.
No, I straight put Facebook on a site blocker. Like I just can't do it. I don't care. I hate it.
I mean, but you're like in the you're a name now that people
right.
talk about, and like and you read that every morning, and that just that absolutely blows my mind.
I mean,
I'm the only person I know in my industry that does that. I thought it was a common practice, and I started talking to people about it. I'm like, oh, you're reading the comments. And they're like, oh, I never read negative reviews. And I'm like, what? I thought this was the bitter pill you had to swallow every morning. It was the price.
A couple of people I know, they're like, it's like a movie. You make the movie and you never look back.
Yeah, I hate that because I know those people are lying. When they say like, oh, I never read the reviews. I'm like, yeah, you're lying. There's no way. There's just no way. I can't imagine. I don't know. I think about designs as like, it's a conversation, right? And I always tell folks when they ask me about like, oh, the success of Root, the thing that I say that's so heartening about it is like, there's always a breakthrough hit. That's fine. There's always a game that does really well. Root, I didn't think it was going to be that game. I didn't plan on Root being that game, but it was heartening as someone who loves interactive games, more older school games, maybe, to walk around the halls of Gen Con that year and see people crouched on the floor. Gen Con used to not have very many tables for playing, if you've been,
Yeah.
And they're throwing dice and shouting and yelling and laughing and having arguments about the game. And I thought, oh, like, I'm getting to steer the conversation a little bit. this is my, in the same way that Wingspan comes out, and then of course we're going to have lots of nature games because people want to capture some of that heat. And it isn't like, people sometimes will say like, oh, all those copycats, all those Wingspan copycats. And they're completely missing the point, because I'm like, don't you get what Elizabeth did? Like, she made grown-ups more adult. She steered the conversation about what games can look like.
Yeah.
And so that, to me, that the thrill of the whole publishing rat race and everything is that when you have an audience who's interested in your work, you get to participate in the steering of the conversation. And it's never unilateral. It's always like there are a lot of hands on that steering wheel. And maybe the way you want to turn it is like not the way the larger conversation could go, right? It might be that I go off on a weird little detour, which, like, Oath to me is the picking up of a design thread, or like that's a weird metaphor. It's like it was like a limb in the great game design tree. It was like a limb from the 80s that was dead, about a way to think about campaign games. And I'm thinking about a game called Barbarian, Kingdom, and Empire, but there's a lot of them like that. And it's like this limb was dead. No one was making games like this. And when Rob Daviau and those folks started doing legacy games, they had their strategy. And I kind of wanted to go back to down the tree of game design, back in time a little, and knock that limb and be like, I don't know if this limb is actually dead. Maybe there's this other way. Now, it could turn out that limb is dead. And the little treehouse I built on it will crash down. That's fine too. But like, to me, reading the negative reviews is part of that process. And I also, I think I've written game reviews, and I like reading criticism as much as, and I mean that like in the very broad sense. I love reading essays about film and books. Like when I get like my New Yorker in the mail, this is second New Yorker batch. It's just because I'm behind right now, and so all afternoon I've just been catching up on my subscription. But I always read Talk of the Town first, and then I read the critics, and then I'll read the feature pieces. But I love reading, even if it's like a dance company I don't know anything about. I love reading that stuff. And so if writing a negative review is hard, it's really, really tough. And so if someone wants to write a negative review of Root, I am so here for it. I love reading Root negative reviews because they're grappling with something that's tricky, and they know they're going to get some hate, some blowback. So they're doing a kind of brave thing. And oftentimes the reason why they don't like the game is because it is fundamentally out of alignment with their taste. Mm-hmm. And those reviews are like the easiest ones to read because you give yourself an easy pass. You're like, oh, well, this wasn't the game for you. But every once in a while, I'll get a review of Root about its narrative, and I'll think like, this guy, he sees a problem with the game. It doesn't make the game less fun or good or anything like that, mm-hmm. but he's making a reasonable critique. There's a talk by a guy whose name I forgot, Scott Westerfield, maybe, I don't know. It was a Shucks talk. And it was called Victory Points Are Evil, or Victory Points Are Bad Design was the name of the talk. And he used Root as an example of a game that doesn't know where its climax is, because you can win the game by crafting a boot, and that feels anticlimactic. And I think so. I think he's picking up on an interesting thing about Root, which is sometimes the players don't know when the climax is.
Yeah, absolutely.
But
yeah.
Those thoughts, I'd been thinking a lot about that. One of the problems with victory point systems is that the games end at funny times. They might not end at the moment of like dramatic power. And Oath doesn't have victory points, in part because I wanted to think about like, what does it look like a game that really is narrative first, mm-hmm. and that is going to end like a bolt of lightning every single time. And that's like how Oath works. Like, it is a game that like it ends precisely the moment it's supposed to end. And what we found when people play it is some folks love the hell out of that, and other folks hate it because they're like, well, but I was just kidding. And it was like, no, you weren't in the court when the king got poisoned and he snatched the crown, and this dude just won. And no one cares about the farm you were trying to build out in the hinterland. Whereas Root would be like, well, let's see how many points that farm's worth now. And so I think that, there's some choices, but there's just so much to be gained from reading negative reviews. Everyone should do it.
Ryan, do you have any other? Because we have just a few minutes left. Do you have any?
Yeah, you got 10, 15. I can go a little over.
Well, I just go ahead, Ryan. Do you have one?
Well, I mean, we touched on it too with the games that you just have shelved. If you've got if you got 8 to 10 for your career, you're going to have like what 50 to 5,000 ideas just.
That is a good question. How many are getting thrown away? I've gotten better about not throwing them away lately. Where I think one thing that happens is you get better as you get more games under your belt. Is you start designing in a way and you realize like, oh, this is actually like a fundamentally bad idea. Like I thought this was going to lead to a game, but it's not, and so I'm going to throw it away. And usually the way I end up designing. I design very backwards from most designers. So the vast majority of designers that I know, and there's absolutely nothing wrong with this. This is my own idiosyncrasy. The vast majority of designers I know start with a mechanical conceit, some cool worker placement trick or an auction style or something. And then they hunt for an appropriate theme and they build the game around the union of those two. Mm-hmm. I start from a system perspective where I have like a story I want to tell. I have a set of pressures, to bring back that word, and in that system that I want to build. And then I'm trying to build a game that creates that system. And so some playtesters I exhaust because they're like, I signed up for a worker placement game, but now we're playing an auction game? Like, what are you doing? Like late in the playtesting, I'll just take a big chunk of the design and toss it away. Because I iterate on mechanism very, very, very fast in development because I'm like, oh, this isn't the right system. Throw it away. So like Oath is interesting in that regard because there were many oaths. The oath that exists is like Oath 9 or 10, depending on how you count the major versions. And I was like, I had this idea for the game and I had these mechanical problems and I would build like a mechanical treatment that I thought was a good idea. And it just wouldn't quite fire, or like the bigger problem was the games worked, but they were fundamentally too small. They weren't adaptable. And the whole thing about Oath is it has to be adaptable. So if the game failed in that qualification, I like threw it away. And sometimes there were a few good ideas I could kind of billet and like take away those like, oh, this action structure I really like, and I might use that in the future. So I'll scrap it for parts. So like a lot of games are dying. A lot of games are kind of falling by the wayside. My hit rate now is pretty high. I think I have like probably a 0.5 batting where I'll work on a game, and if it doesn't, like, usually I can iterate myself to the game that I want to make. And I mean, by the end of the process, it will almost never look like the first version of that game. But every once in a while I do start a game and I'm like, oh, actually this just fundamentally won't work. And this is a total dead end. Now, in terms of like themes and general mechanisms that I want to be working in, I have tons of those. I'm so deep. I'm reading Children of Ash and Elm right now about the Vikings, and there's so many like quirky, weird things in Viking sociology that I'm like, oh, that would be a great game. What a cool, like, I want like these weird temple rites that Vikings did. It's so fascinating. Or like, I want to do, like, yeah, there's so much, right? And so most of those, though, I'm like, this is probably a non-starter or someone else. Like Viking theme is totally overdone. Other people are going to take this kind of stuff. And so I'm pretty good at just kind of discarding those things. I would really, so as I mentioned, I was reading this book about the history of the Bible, which is great, by this guy named John Barton. It's fabulous if you like grew up in a religious household, or if you're currently religious, or if you're not religious but you're interested in it. It's a great book. But I'm like, doing a lot of studies on like New Testament apologetics and textual history and like Q and all the relation of the Gospels and that kind of stuff. And I'm like, ooh, it would be so cool to do a game about text, like a deduction game about textual history. That would be awesome. And that is, boy, I'm not going to sell that game anywhere. And so like that, it just kind of floats, and who knows, maybe it'll turn into something, maybe
not. Did that answer your question, Ryan?
Oh, absolutely.
Oh, okay.
Absolutely.
I'm going to end on this, and it's up to you when you want to.
I can do a couple more questions then.
No. This is the question. Have you ever heard, when you were talking about narrative, 2 games, and earlier it came up, King's Dilemma, I'm sure you've heard of that one.
Yep.
And then also Holding On, The Troubled Life of Billy Kerr. by Hub. Have you heard of that one?
Okay, wait. Say the other one again.
The second one is called Holding On: The Troubled Life.
Oh yeah, Holding On. Sure.
Billy Kerr. Yeah. So the first one, I think it's a good game because of the way it does its narrative stuff, and that you're forced into it's not empathetic, but you're forced into making decisions you want to otherwise make that might put you as the moral bad guy, right? So there's that one, and it moves its narrative along that way. I think the more interesting one of the two is Holding On, in terms of
interesting.
Is it a good game? Well, what do you mean by good game? It does probably really well what it's designed to do, right? Of making you think, okay, if I experience these things, then I'm doing what it's more of an experience than a game.
Sure.
So there's been a lot of video games that have been really good at that, of having us empathize with the person who we're playing as, right? As you talk about the narrative experience of Oath, how close do you think a board game can get? So that's what I'm getting at with.
Yeah, sure.
How close can a board game truly get to the narrative experience that a more full sense thing experience like a video game, in VR and so forth.
So it's so funny because I think most of the people playing board games, well, most everybody who's living right now is playing video games of some description. It might be Candy Crush on their phone. It might be, what's that game called? Like Going Home from Home. Anyway, or Oberdin, or maybe it's the new Call of Duty, right? There's a lot of different narrative experiences out there. And so when we're thinking about narrative in games, the tendency is to use video games as a reference point. So I've played a lot of King's Dilemma, and it's good. But King's Dilemma is a lot like a video game. It reminds me of Reigns. Yeah. It seems like it's pretty clearly modeled on Reigns, which is fine. Reigns is great. It's an open narrative space. It also reminds me of another game I love called The King of Dragon Pass, an old game, which is fabulous. And if you like the King's Dilemma but don't have the group, just get yourself a copy of 6 Ages, which is the follow-up to King of Dragon Pass, because it will tickle all the same parts. But that is a very novelistic way of telling stories, and it's and in a way cinematic.
Right.
Games are not either of those things, in my opinion. Board games can do those things, but I don't think they do them very well. So like Pandemic Legacy, I always tell people, is a better TV show than it is a game. Yeah. And it isn't to say that it's a bad game. It's not. Davio and his crew did a great job on it. But it is, to me, it is fundamentally kind of on rails. And it reminds me of those interactive movies you might go to at I'll drop a Midwestern reference, like a King's Island or something, where they put you in a chair and and you feel it. So you're feeling these pressures, but everything the game can do, it knows it can do. It's fundamentally scripted, right? And Oath is so not that I think this is the thing that I'm always tricky about, because sometimes when folks get excited about the game and talk to me about it, they'll describe it as if it's like super Pandemic Legacy, and I'm like, no. It's like Spelunky. It is totally like emergent, class-driven design, class in the programming sense, where you have all these object classes, right, that behave in different ways and put in conjunction. And so when I think about the narrative that tabletop games can do, it's a lot more like theater. It's a lot more like, what is the word I want? Is it impromptu? Is that it? No.
Well, I mean, do you mean impromptu or extemporaneous? They're slightly different.
They're slightly different, but I guess I'm talking about improvisation, not impromptu. My God, It's late here. Improv. It's a lot more like improv.
Okay.
And so it creates a set of dramatic tensions. It's more like role playing, where you have the rules of the system are set, the actions of the players are set. And to me, the reason why, I tend to avoid co-op games mostly because I think that the drama is better if the players are focused around a victory condition. It's a better engine. It's a better generator
Mm-hmm.
to put into a narrative. You know, I want to play, like, I want to watch improv, competitive improv. You know what I mean? Like, there needs to be some incentive structure that is going to power it, because it's just going to amp up the whole experience. And I think that is a place where tabletop games can go much deeper in their narrative craft than movies or books. They can do something much, much, much deeper, because there are games I've played of Mafia growing up that I remember like books that I've read. And in the same way, like in the same way that people will remember memorable sports matches, and they'll be like, "Oh, do you remember that Notre Dame game?" And they'll talk about it, right? Like that, like the game form is a very powerful narrative tool, but it's at its most powerful when it leans into the improvisation and the creativity of its players. Because my general attitude about theming, and I could talk for hours about the theming strategy in Oath, is to provide players with tools, but as few guardrails as possible. I want the players to be the creative force behind the game. And I'm a prop man in all of this. Like, I'm just trying to make sure that that they have props that open up areas and not close things down. And so one of the things that you see in, like, and I think, you know, I want to read the think piece about Dune versus the King's Dilemma, because both games are trying to tell similar kinds of stories, but they have diametrically opposed strategies about how to tell those stories. Oh, yeah. And I think one of the things that happens, I think that it isn't that one method is better than the other. I think that they have different risk profiles and different rewards. Mm-hmm. And the short version is that the on-rails approach of the King's Dilemma is a lot more even. Mm-hmm. Dune, I have played a lot of bad games of Dune, where the two leading players were like, Shai Hulud, let's ally. Okay, the game's over.
Yeah.
Well, that was horrible, right? Yeah. But there are some games of Dune that I'll remember for as long as I can remember things, that are just absolutely incredible. And the King's Dilemma kind of slides in the middle, right? You know, it has a couple of Fierios, a couple of those turn moments that are brilliant, but fundamentally, it is cleverer than the players, or that's its approach. Yeah. Whereas Dune and Peter Laka and the rest of the Eon crew, they're so good at, like, this is a framework, go wild. So, and I'll just say this kind of briefly, that for the people who backed Oath on Kickstarter, this is a sales pitch, although depending on when this goes up, you can still back it for late backers. But we included this little Chronicle journal. I wish I had my little prototype here. I could show you. It was a fun thing to design, because we designed the Chronicle journal with no instructions. We kind of like designed a page layout. We designed in papers. We will put some guidelines up on our website for people who want it. But when we were building it, I was like, I don't know how people are going to use this. I don't even know if they're going to. And it was so funny because we have a rule with it, which is like, the winner of the game gets to write the page, gets to tell what happened in that game. That was kind of the conceit behind the thing. And we didn't really test it in the wild that much. We kind of couldn't. But I had one with me while I was home over the summer for a little bit and playing the game with a few different groups. And they did all sorts of crazy things with this book. One person like wrote a comic. They were like writing. They were doing all like just weird work. And it was funny because the in papers are supposed to be like a list of kings, like a ancient Egypt, like a chronicle of kings. And so you write who the winners are, and then someone thought that it looked like a yearbook page, and they wrote like little like see you next game, like, and it was kind of wonderful because it was like, oh well, they're doing graffiti, like, it's all, it's still in the mode, and I don't know if folks are going to use that. So right now we're in a really funny stage with Oath where, like, the game's done, it's in production, and what we're doing right now is I have a little bit of creative budget left in terms of like staffing, is we're just building tools. So we're building like card databases, places where you can upload your games, really cool FAQ, some other things. And we don't know if people are going to use any of it. But we just kind of thought, like, let's build a suite of tools and we'll just see what people do.
I'm going to back it now.
For your time. I mean, that's
I got one.
I'm trying not to get excited about it, but yeah.
No. I mean, it's its own. I don't know. Like, here's the thing about it, though. it is both like a very simple game, but also a game that I beseech you to please use our card-driven walkthrough, because I have seen Teaches of Oath like crash and burn, because there is so like Root gives you a little breadcrumb path. It's like, hey, do this, you'll get a point, and you'll get this. So it's pretty easy, even though Root can be sometimes a hard teach. Once it lifts off, the plane will kind of like slowly gain altitude.
You're
And
right.
Oath, the base rules, like the core rules of like how you move, how you get cards, how you get resources, very easy. Could fit on a page, super straightforward. But then the question of how you win is like the gift that keeps zooming into the eye, because there's no guidance and you can really mess it up. And so what will happen when players teach it badly is they'll start being like, well, okay, like last game, so someone will be like, what should I do? And then they'll be like, well, last game I did this and I won and I started doing these things, and they're giving like horrible advice. But they don't know it. So like I usually tell folks, like, use the walkthrough. It's so it will get you there. It will get you there. It's a little bit of a hard teach, but it's not a hard game. I mean, it is a hard game. It's I don't know. I have no idea how well this game's going to do, but I think it's important to go into it with kind of like an open, like it ain't Root and it ain't Pax Pamir. It's its own thing. One more like little note on Root. I see this is what I mean about going on. When I started Oath, it was kind of like Root was sort of like accessible coin to, like thinking about like Voko's work on Andean Abyss and other games, and like, can you do that in a different setting? And then Root kind of like came from that mulling, and Oath came from this mulling where I was thinking about PAX games and trying to do them in a different setting. But Oath is not really like an accessible PAX game. Like, get PAX Pamir or maybe PAX Viking. I haven't played PAX Viking. Like, those are the good entry levels to PAX games. Mm-hmm. What Oath is an accessible version of these very weird games that Phil Eklund made in the 90s called the Lords games.
Oh, yeah.
And so the Lords games are these like epic, like 10-hour, like just unbelievable designs that don't really work, but their ambition is so great and the heat they put off is so strong that you just can't help but be charmed by them. At least I can't help. And in some ways, the PAX games were an attempt to boil that experience down. But I love the PAX games. Yeah. But I think that they fundamentally are not like the Lords games.
You're right.
And they kind of like boiled it down in a different way. And Oath is like a weird attempt to boil it down. It's a different way of attacking that same problem. And in that way, I'm like, okay, that's what Oath is doing. Now, that is not a line I can put on a Kickstarter, because no one's going to like, okay, hey, you guys remember those 90s games that came in Ziploc bag? Like, it's a bad pitch. And so, that's why it's the game that remembers. We need something that's like crisp and simple that people can latch onto. But it's, I don't know. I don't know how it will do, but I'm excited for people to play it, because everyone on the team, we spent a crazy amount of time on this game. Like a year and a half with a full creative staff. Like, there's so much stuff in that box, and we just want people to get into it. And so I'm happy for any and all reviews when they start rolling.
I'll have to tag you in it. Well,
please.
For my wife's account, because
of course. Yeah. I only do Twitter because I still get more. Twitter's still more fun than it is psychologically damning. And so I keep there, but the other places I'm out.
Oh yeah, that's right. I can't use Twitter because I'm a Luddite. I look at it and I'm like, what's the order of these things?
It's a very reasonable, like, there's a book I read in grad school by Eli Parser called The Filter Bubble, which is just prophetic, and it's entirely about like what it means for an algorithm to arrange content for you and the kinds of behavior it encourages. And it is a damning book. It is a read where you're like, wow, I wish everybody had to read this book in high school. And it makes me so suspicious. So like we are very like free range parents. I let my kids wander around. They're very like, wild and rambunctious, but and if they want to watch a weird movie, or if they want to like, play a hard game or whatever, like or read like I read like a few chapters of Watership Down to them. Like, they're not closeted kids, but they are absolutely not allowed on YouTube. Yeah. It is the like, I am terrified of it, because there'll be moments where like they'll accidentally like have someone's phone and then like they'll get 3 videos in and I'm like, oh no. Yeah. Like this is the worst thing to put in your mind. I can't do it. And I recognize that this is like me as a parent. Other parents are gonna have different priorities. There's no right way to do it. But that is my biggest fear. Like algorithm. Like I don't want this is I sound like a tin capper, but like I just don't want the algorithm jacking with their mind. I want to be the editors of their mind for just like a little bit longer.
Yeah, that makes sense.
I want to be the curators. That's the better word.
Yeah.
We highly moderate YouTube consumption in the house.
Yeah,
but it's still like. But there's a hard rule: you skip every single ad because I'm not paying for premium. But if I see her watching ads, I'm like, skip that.
Get that out there. Yeah, we have a few exceptions. My older son used to be obsessed with model trains, so we'd watch like some of the model train YouTube, which is a good YouTube dive.
Yeah, I watch a lot of the modeling YouTube. And
sure.
Best modelers are train modelers.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. Well, this was a lot of fun, guys. Thank you.
That was fantastic. That was a great conversation. Thanks, Cole.